The future is a concept. It doesn't exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds Podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about.
And other things.
We are here with Doug Valentine. He is an author, an investigator, journalist, and poet. Portions of his research materials are archived at the National Security Archive, both a Vietnam collection and a separate drug enforcement collection, Texas Tech University, its Vietnam Center, and John Jay College. Some of his previous works include the Phoenix Program, the CIA as Organized Crime, The Strength of the Wolf, and more. His latest 2020 release is called TDY. So thank you for doing this, and how are you today? How are you holding up during this crazy corona chaos?
Well, like everybody else, I'm, just trying to be practical, focus on doing, what's smart and staying within the guidelines, and hopefully not getting my blood pressure up, trying to stay calm and cool. And I find not watching network news helps a lot in keeping my blood pressure down, because it's just like a horror story, to watch it. And I don't feel like I learn a lot from watching it. I get my updates on the internet, and see what the headlines are and how things are going around the country. And I guess like everybody else, I check in on those parts of the country where I have friends, and to see how they're doing and how things are going. And I pay more attention to the local news in my own area now than I had before, because interested to know, is it erupting? Is the virus erupting in nearby towns and stuff like that? And I suppose like everybody, it depending on where you are, you're more or less affected. And we had a old folks home in the town where I lived, which is called Longmeadow, Massachusetts. It's part of a Jewish center, and it was overrun by the virus. So it makes you think, well, healthcare people and family members were going in and out of this facility. And then all of a sudden, one day they discover that 10 or 12 people have the virus. Well, how many other people then, spread out around town, and so you don't know. And it seems like, you just got to err on the side of caution. So that's what we're doing.
Now, when you're doing research for your books and investigating the CIA's paramilitary operations and criminal drug trafficking activities, this seems like a brave and challenging task.
Yeah, I sort of fell into it in a way. If I wrote my first book about my father, okay, and that was called The Hotel Talk Logan. And I'm 70 years old, so I grew up during the Vietnam War, and a lot of my friends went to the war. And back in those days, there was this phenomena called the generation gap, where guys my age who were, eligible to go to Vietnam, their fathers had all been in World War II, okay? And they had saved the world for democracy, and they had an attitude that, America was great and could do no wrong. And we were young kids, 17, 18, and we liked Muhammad Ali. I don't know if you know who Muhammad Ali was, but he was this very famous boxer, and he refused to go to Vietnam. And, he said, no, Viet Cong never called me nigger, and he wouldn't go, and they put him in prison. And it was, my generation had this big conflict with our fathers over, what the meaning of patriotism was and who should fight in wars and why. And it's really not like it is so much now. But anyway, my father and I didn't talk to each other. We were apart. And when I was 30 years old, my father had his second open heart surgery. Okay. And he was dying. It's 1981. And he called me up on the phone and he said, I understand you want to be a writer. Why don't you come home and I'll tell you a story? Okay. And we hadn't talked to each other for like 10 years. And I went home, and it turned out that when he was in the hospital, he was having terrible nightmares about what happened to him in the war. And they said, you can't get better. You won't be, you just won't get better unless you tell somebody what happened. He had PTSD, okay, post-traumatic stress syndrome. It turns out that he'd been a prisoner of war in the Philippines in a Japanese camp, and he never told anybody, okay? And he told me the story. And not only did it provide me with the material for my first book, I had wanted to be a writer, but I didn't have a story, but it enabled my father and I to heal and the relationship, because it turned out that all the problems that we had were because he had been sworn to secrecy. He was in this prison camp in the Philippines, and when it was liberated in October 1944, the military made him sign a non-disclosure statement saying he would never tell what happened in this prison camp. And they gave him a whole new military record saying that he had been elsewhere during the war. And they basically told him, if you ever tell anybody what happened in this prison camp, or that you had been in this prison camp, that will put you on trial, will court-martial you. There was actually a murder in this camp, and we'll put you on trial. And my father played a small role in it that will put you on trial. So my father had been part of a military cover-up, and it had affected his relationship with everybody in the family. Okay? When you have to hold a secret like that, and not only did it cause him 2 heart attacks, but it made him angry. It caused all sorts of psychological problems, which then manifest in the family relationships. Okay? And so I then became very interested in this subject. What happens to veterans who've been in situations, they come back from the war and they can't tell anybody about it? And now they bring the war home back with them. Okay, now it's not just them who suffer, but it's everybody in their family. And when you have an abusive parent, it lasts with you for your whole life. Okay, it's not something that goes away. So I was interested in how war affects family members, and in particular, how it affects soldiers who've been part of covert operations and military cover-ups. So I wanted to write a second book, and I wanted to write it about the Vietnam War. And I wanted to write it hopefully about a part of the Vietnam War that had been covered up. And I could see how it was affecting my contemporaries, guys who people my own age. And I found out about this CIA program called the Phoenix program, which was a very secret CIA program which involved American soldiers, and in Vietnam, they were targeted against the civilian members of the Viet Cong organization, the National Liberation Front, not the soldiers, the Viet Cong soldiers who were in the villages or hiding out in the jungle and then attacking American soldiers and American forces, but the civilians who were their political leaders. And these people were school teachers during the day, or they ran even had a government position with the government of South Vietnam. They were secret agents. They were, under an alias and leading a double life. And so the CIA created this program, the Phoenix program, to go out and identify these secret agents, the people who were running the insurgency. the civilians. You can think of them as they'd be like the mayor of Macon, Georgia during the Civil War. Okay, they were political people, and they're organizing like intelligence networks and spy networks, and they're helping to supply the guerrilla units. They're involved in all sorts of different things, but it's civilians. And because the United States military is not allowed to target civilians, it became the job of the CIA to get these people. All right, to identify them and capture them and put them in interrogation centers like Guantanamo, or they would send out assassination teams to wipe them out, just to kill them, extrajudicial assassinations. And I wanted to write a book about this program. So being just this kid from nowhere, I asked a guy who had been the head of the CIA, and his name was William Colby. And he had been the director of the Central Intelligence. And during the Vietnam War, he had been in overall charge of this Phoenix program. And he agreed to help me because exactly for the reasons I'm telling you, it affected soldiers who were involved in it. And he felt that I would be sympathetic to the soldiers who were involved in the Phoenix program because my own father had been involved in something like this. Okay. And so he started introducing me to senior CIA officers. He would call up he called up a guy named Evan Parker, who had been the first CIA director of the Phoenix program. And Colby and this guy Parker had both been in World War II together as part of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. They had known each other for over 20 years. They had worked together for 20 years. So these were very senior CIA officers. And he just called up this guy Parker and said, talk to Valentine. And so and he did that like with, 5 or 6 people. And then they in turn referred me to more people. And so within a year or two, all of a sudden I'm talking to like 50, 60, 70 senior CIA officers. And nobody had ever done anything like that before. Nobody. And so all of a sudden I had this groundbreaking book, and I learned all about the CIA. And that's how that happened. It was sort of a combination of luck and being in the right place at the right time and being the first person to want to do this. And I should add that they thought Colby and all these other CIA guys thought I was going to give them a sympathetic treatment in the book. But it really wasn't the same thing that my father had gone through. My father was a prisoner. He didn't have any choice in doing the things he did, but these people were choosing to do the things that they did. And I should also add that Phoenix has since the Phoenix program has become for the model for the way that the CIA and even the United States military now wage warfare around the world in the age of the war on terror. Phoenix was the template for how the war in Iraq is fought. It's the template for how war in Afghanistan is fought. It's how the American empire and its military now police the world. It's through a Phoenix type program that the military has now adopted and spread worldwide. And the Phoenix program is also, I should add, the model for the Department of Homeland Security. Mm-hmm. So it has a lot of, importance, and it's important to understand it.
Definitely, I agree. How did the relationship with you and William Colby come about? How did you get in contact with him initially?
I looked him up in the phone book. I had read about the Phoenix program, and I was interested in it. And he had testified to Congress on, to defend Phoenix before Congress. So it was well known that he was the spokesperson for the Phoenix program and that he had run it. So I looked him. I knew he lived in Washington, D.C. I figured he lived in Washington, D.C., and I looked him up. And I found his address. He was working at a law office. And I sent him a copy of my book, The Hotel Talk Lobo, that I had read about my father. And I put a letter in with the book, and I said, I'd like to write a book about the Phoenix program. Will you let me come down and interview you? And, like about a week later, the phone rings. So my wife answers it. you know, and she goes, Doug, William Colby's on the phone. And I said, hi, Mr. Colby, I guess you got the book. And he goes, oh, just call me Bill, and he said, come on down and talk to me. And so I put on a suit and a tie and I drove down to Washington, D.C. And I went to his law office and I presented myself to him. I had about a half an hour initial conversation with him. I look like a Methodist choir boy. I'm white. I'm pretty good looking. I was athletic. I understood about soldiers because of this book I had written about my father, which Colby either read or skimmed through. And he thought that because of, and Colby himself, and there's another dimension to it, had a son my age that he was alienated from for all, the same reasons, okay, this generation gap. And he had a daughter, Colby had a daughter who died at a very tender age, like 21 or 22, of anorexia from all the controversy surrounding the Phoenix program. She was so distraught that her father was in charge of this program that assassinated close to 40,000 civilians in South Vietnam that she starved herself to death. So I think subconsciously, Colby looked at me like a son that he could talk to, in the same way that my father had talked to me. And all the CIA officers that I talked with were all, I had developed this sort of father-son relationship with all of them. They were all my father's age. And it was almost like this subtle psychological thing going on where, in trying to reach me and tell me about the secret things that they had done, which they could not tell their own families, that they were reestablishing some sort of contact and repairing relations with their own family. Okay, so there were all sorts of very strange, your program is called Philosophical Minds, and I would begin by asking each one of these people, well, what's your philosophy of life? Why do you do what you do? And they liked that I had this eclectic, a very well educated, even though I'm a college dropout, I have, I'm always read and I was able to write and I'm well spoken. And they saw me as a person who would understand them intellectually. And so they opened up about everything. I wasn't a person from Columbia Journalism School. So I had not been trained how to be deferential to them. Instead, I had developed, when you're a professional journalist, you don't have a personal relationship with a CIA officer. You have a professional relationship. But I immediately established personal relationships with all these people. And in doing that, and in very subtly establishing personal relationships with them, they opened up to me in a way that they would never have opened up to a regular journalist. Okay, and so there were all these subtle dynamics going on, plus which Colby had said I was okay, and he had been the director. So after a while, I started knowing more about the Phoenix program than any one of them individually, because they had been in a particular part of the program here, or a particular part of the program there, or they had been there in 1967, or then in 1971 for a year. And pretty soon I knew the whole thing, and I knew all the aspects of it. And they all started thinking, well, if Colby sent him, he must be in the CIA.
Now, what was the general philosophy of some of these guys? Did they share things, and what kind of responses did you get when asking them about that?
Well, they're ideologues, okay? And they're not, they have pretensions to being the elite, okay? Because they're in the CIA, they're protected. They can do all sorts of illegal things all around the world. They can spy on people. They can start wars. They can assassinate people. They can torture people. All these things that they do, and all of it's illegal. They're protected from it. So they automatically, after a while, start thinking of themselves as entitled. All right. And therefore, everything that they believe, anything that they believe, they don't have to question. But they all believe the same thing, because you can't become a CIA officer if you're a communist. You know, you can't, you could maybe have red marks, but you can't see any value in it. So ideologically, they have to exclude anything that is heterodoxical to the idea that they and America are a force for good, and that anything that they do is therefore good too. And as long as you, in a sense, stroke them and tell them, yes, that's right, and support these, this very monolithic philosophy that they have, then they become comfortable, and they'll tell you everything that they've done. Okay, and yet at the same time, they're really the most self-deceived people I had ever met in my life. They're absolutely, totally unable to question their own beliefs, to question their own actions, or to get involved in any sort of self-criticism. And as you know, you cannot create or maintain or expand a philosophical mind without challenging all your basic principles. Okay, like somebody like Hegel, what he did was to challenge everything, and he comes up with the idea that it's dialectics. That is how you go about challenging all your beliefs. And it's only by challenging your beliefs that you can become a free person. Well, these people, the CIA, have convinced themselves that they're bringing freedom to the world by being totally self-critical. Okay, and it gets at the very heart of why America is stuck, and why it's both at the reason that it becomes so powerful, because it never questions itself. So it simply knows that everything it's doing is right, and therefore has no restraints, and it's free to do anything it wants without any shame or any remorse, because this is what it does, and it can do all these. It has no philosophical mind really, although it convinces itself that because it's the best, because it's the most powerful, that it must be doing everything right. Okay, and so it creates what's called a self-perpetuating machine, and it's a self-perpetuating machine, which the CIA is absolutely and totally the personification of. It does everything in secret, because if it told you what it was doing, it would undermine your faith in what America really is. And at the same time, it feels that this is its strength. Everything it does in secret, and at the same time, that's its strength. And it controls all the information that we receive here in the United States, which accounts for why Americans are the most indoctrinated and propagandized people in the world, because they are not allowed self-criticism. It's why Trump has so much appeal, because the last thing he ever does is question himself or question his beliefs. And so he becomes the personification of the spirit, what is, the American philosophical mind.
Now, would you mind giving the listeners a brief peek into a few historical notes in relation to the CIA and their organized crime dealings?
Well, sure. And it begins actually before there's a CIA. Okay? To think that the United States was not involved in criminal activities as policy before the CIA is a mistake. But you can actually, a good example is what happened in China in the mid-1920s. Okay, Um, China is a big bone of contention, still is. All right. And through the 18th and 19th century, various colonial powers had carved up China into a lot of fiefdoms. The French had a piece, the English had a piece, everybody had a piece of China. And they destabilized China the British destabilized China by pushing opium on it. They fought two wars, opium wars in in China, one in 1848 and the other in 1862, I think. Very famous, the Opium Wars. Okay, the British actually pushed opium on China in order to subvert it and to soften it up so they could take control of it. All right, that's a criminal enterprise on the behalf of a colonial empire, and all colonization of foreign countries is essentially a criminal enterprise. All right, you're going in and you're taking over a foreign country, and you're putting in a puppet administration that answers to you, and then you subjugate all those people. Criminal enterprise. Okay, all of Western wealth was built on these kind of criminal enterprises. But by the 20th century, with advances in technology and communication and travel, it was becoming harder to maintain the myth that these colonial empires were somehow good. I mean, people were starting to act up, and in China in the 1920s, the Communist Party was coming to power. So the United States did not want to see China fall to the communists, so it backed an individual named Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist Chinese party, the Kuomintang. Okay, now they gave this guy airplanes so he could fight the communists. All right, and sent military advisors to Chiang Kai-shek. But the only way that Chiang Kai-shek could pay for these airplanes that the United States was sending to him was through the opium trade. Okay. He was connected to all the opium warlords and underworld figures. And so the United States necessarily had to protect his opium trafficking enterprise in order so he could continue to buy the airplanes and the guns and all these other things that were necessary to have him arm him against the communists. And a lot of his drugs were coming into the United States in the 1930s. All right. And I write about this in my book called The Strength of the Wolf, which is about the origins of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. I lay it all out in painful detail, all of it absolutely, properly sourced. How the head of the Bureau of Narcotics knew that Chinese diplomats and gangsters were bringing opium from Chiang Kai-shek into San Francisco and giving it to the Tongs, and then the Tongs were selling it to Lucky Luciano and the mafia. And whenever one of these Chinese diplomats or people that was working for Chiang Kai-shek got arrested accidentally, they covered it up. The State Department covered it up. The Department of Justice covered it up. But, by the time World War II came around, and now you're fighting not just the communists, but the fascists, it became necessary for the United States to have an organization that could deal with criminal enterprises all around the world. Not just Chiang Kai-shek and his criminal underworld in China, but criminal underworlds all over the world. For example, in France. Now, William Colby, who had been the head of the CIA, right? During World War II, he was in the OSS, and the OSS parachuted Colby into occupied France. And he dealt with the French underground, which was largely communists, okay? And because they were the only ones fighting the Nazis and who were occupying France. And so they existed in an underground. And so the OSS starts forming relationships with underground organizations all over the world. again, in China, just everywhere. And they learn how to smuggle agents into foreign countries to give them false identification, teaches them how to smuggle radios and guns into foreign countries so that insurgent groups can use them. Okay. They also learn how to smuggle things into foreign countries so they can put down insurgencies. And by the time World War II is over, the OSS is this huge organization. It's dealing with criminal underworlds all around the world. And they decide to keep it in place and call it the CIA. And to let it continue to do these same sort of operations, only now it's completely secret. It's a civilian organization. And for example, when the United States invades Italy in World War II, it was through the OSS that they formed relationships through the Italian mafia in New York City with the mafia in Sicily. And so when the United States Army invades Sicily, it's the mafia contacts that the CIA, which is in the OSS, has in the United States, which arrange with their compatriots, their cousins, their brothers, their fathers in Sicily, to work with the OSS and the US military to pay the invasion of Sicily. So this is how, okay, so now all of this just keeps expanding and expanding until finally, and I'll give you one last example. When the CIA wants to assassinate Fidel Castro in 1960, who do they hire to do this? They hire the biggest drug trafficker in the United States, a guy named Santo Trafficante. Trafficante had run all the casinos in many of the casinos for the mafia in Cuba up until the time of the Cuban Revolution. And so he had a lot of contacts in Cuba with the people who were still fighting Castro at that time. So the CIA goes to Santo Trafficante and it says, can you smuggle poison pills into Cuba and have your friends give them to Castro? And he says, yes, sure. But at that time, Santo Trafficante was the biggest drug smuggler in the United States. And so for the rest of his life, he was a protected person, okay? Because he's basically working for the CIA. And the CIA is using contacts in the criminal underworld, like Santo Trafficante, every day, in every way, all around the world in 1,000 different ways. And this is how they conduct their business. This is how they manage to blackmail people. This is how they manage to hire a burglar in Spain to go burglarize somebody's apartment. And then if the guy gets caught, the CIA is not connected. It's just a burglar in Spain. But you have connections to him through the Spanish police. So, you know, using cutouts and spy techniques, you can actually get a burglar unwitting that he's working for the CIA to go do a black bag job for you. And this is how the CIA built its empire and runs it all around the world.
Now it's fascinating. I mean, black operations and the mystery surrounding them. So with TDY, this stands for temporary duty assignment.
Yeah.
Now, are these temporary duty assignments typically how one would be led into one of these black operations?
No, mostly it's pretty benign. Okay. For example, the guy in the story, I'll just give you a little background first, okay? The Phoenix Program book was going to come out. It's 1989. I have a publisher. The publisher is William Morrow. They want me to have a photograph to put on the dust jacket of the book, okay? And at the time I was living in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. And so I went, you know, again, I went to the phone book. I looked up photographers, and there was this guy who had a photography store, you know, business in a nearby town. And graduation photos, you know, wedding photos, mom and pop kind of stuff, you know, I mean, it's just portrait photos. And so I went to him to get portrait photos for the book. And he was a Vietnam veteran. And he knew it was for this book, The Phoenix Program. So we started talking about Vietnam. And then he read my book about my father, the Hotel Tacloban, because he got interested in me. And when I went back to get my photographs from him, he said, look, I read your book about your father. I know what you're doing with the Phoenix program. I got a story to tell you. Well, he was the guy that is the main character in the book TDY. I call him Pete. He asked that I not use his right name, his actual name, and that I fictionalize it because he ended up knowing things he wasn't supposed to know, like my father. He was forced to sign a non-disclosure statement saying that the things that you have participated in, you can never talk about. And it's like Trump with his girlfriends. And if you do talk about it, then I can sue you, and take everything you own. And it's a way of paralyzing people and denying them their freedom. But Trump's not the only one to do it. The military and the government do it all the time with people when people learn things that they're not supposed to know, secret things. So they made this guy, Pete, sign a non-disclosure statement. And so he was afraid to talk about what had happened for fear that there would be retaliation for him. But in that regard, this TDY mission is different than most. Now, Pete, the book TDY is set in 1967. And I will just tell you a little bit about it. But at the time, Pete was a photojournalist on a U.S. Air Force base. I mean, and then, later on he becomes an actual photographer. But, he was in the Air Force and it's 1967 and he's a photojournalist and he routinely gets TDY missions, operations, to go to other air bases and to interview people and take their photograph. Or he interviewed, for example, a guy named Chappie James, who was the first African-American general in the Air Force. But he had to get a TDY authorization to go do it because Chappie James was living someplace else. So you're going to leave your base. So you have to get TDY orders to do that. And you go someplace temporarily and you come back. He interviewed a guy who'd been very famous jet pilot. He interviewed Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale, who'd been pitchers for the Los Angeles Dodgers in 1967. So he was used to it. So life on an air base was boring. So he would always sign up for TDY just to get off the air base and to do interesting things. So he signs up for this. He's on a list, a TDY list, and one day they call him in. The personnel director of the air base calls him in and says, we have a different kind of TDY mission for you this time. And there's a hazardous duty pay. So you'll get more than that you usually get. And there's a bonus. And so the guy piece, how much is the bonus? And they said $2,000, which in 1967 is enough to buy a car. So he gets hooked and he goes through different stages. And the book documents the different stages of his being sucked into this highly classified and highly dangerous TDY operation. And he, when he comes back, there's his records, just like with my father, say he was someplace else. And what he actually does is completely off the books. Nobody will ever know. And so it's an action adventure story, and it tells what this mission is all about. And not everybody survives. It's not something that he thought it was going to be. And he gets sucked into it, and at the end of it, he realizes he's just cannon fodder. And again, I don't want to miss the overall point. The books I write are about how these kind of secret operations affect people psychologically. And just like with my father, this guy Pete becomes a damaged person because he has to keep this secret. And it affects everything he does for the rest of his life. It's, he goes through counseling for 10, 20 years. Because how do you deal with this sort of stuff that you've seen? You have knowledge that you know that you can't tell. And if you tell, the government will come and put you in prison. and it affects you. And so what I'm trying to tell people in TDY, it's an allegory. And again, it gets back to this, what I was telling you earlier about the CIA. How in America, we are coerced into not being able to criticize ourselves or openly reflect on who and what we are and what we're doing. The whole society is structured in such a way where self-criticism and questioning of authority is verboten. It's just not allowed. And there's a million mechanisms that the government and business have put in place, including these sort of, Trumpian non-disclosure statements and all sorts of economic conditioning that prevent Americans from actually questioning who they are and what they're doing, let alone what their country's doing. And if you can suppress everybody individually, that they can't even question them about what their own motives are, their own intentions, their own thoughts, their own philosophy, then they're never going to be able to question what the government's doing. Because as any philosopher will tell you, until you free your own mind, you can never critically understand anything else that's going on in the world. So we Americans are subject to 1,000 different ways of keeping us from actually questioning who we are, and what we are, our own assumptions. And TDY becomes an allegory for what all Americans are and what we're all going through, and how this psychologically affects Americans, and how it creates a sort of collective kind of psychosis in America that allows for the perpetuation of this machine that dominates the world, under the assumption that it's under the pretense that it's bringing freedom to people, when that isn't true at all, when it's just a neo-colonial power, which couldn't do what it's doing unless it had brainwashed all its civilians into continually paying 50% of their money to the military, and giving up health care. The rest of the world has health care, telling you, well, you're free. That's why you don't have health care. You don't have health care because you're free. The rest of the people in the world, they're not free. That's why they have health care. And people are just, there's this delusion that defines the American spirit and its concept of what it is. And all these things that I have written about are all trying to get that across to people so that they will question their own basic assumptions about what's true and what's false. Not just about the world, but starting with themselves.
After interviewing all of these different CIA officers and all of these special forces and military personnel, what's the general kind of contention? Are they remorseful at all about these activities?
There's a cross section. All right. An organization like the CIA does not hire a particular type of person because they have a broad need. They have needs for all kinds of people, so there are some people that they hire who are psychopaths, and those people go into its own little military, paramilitary branch, and they'll kill anybody that you tell them to kill, as long as you give them an ice cream cone afterwards, or something like that. They're not the brightest people, but they hire scientists, they hire anthropologists, but they have all the same, they all have to be ideologically pure. So there's a whole cross section of psychologies, but basically everybody has to toe the line. And if you want to and it's the same with the military, okay? If you want to succeed, you have to be able to demonstrate that you adhere to the ideology and that you believe it. In order to get a security clearance, you have to prove that you're ideologically trustworthy. Okay, so through these control of what people think is how people rise in both the CIA and the military, until a lot of people get to a certain point and they can't go any higher because they start having conflicts, and then they're thrown out. All right, and so that's why you have in the FBI, the CIA, the military, this kind of uniform fascism that permeates these organizations where there's very, very little heterodoxical information. You don't have, at West Point, you can't get into West Point unless you believe that you're that America's good, and that it should fight wars around the world. So success and it depends on how well you adhere to it. A lot of people try to fudge it, and they see that there's contradictions, but they become so indoctrinated after a while that just like a spouse stops criticizing, a wife stops criticizing a husband in order to sort of have a good relationship in the family. That becomes the way that people deal with it. They just give up trying to change the system. But the system in the military and in the CIA and the FBI is run by people, managers who understand that they have to keep everybody in the same ideological pain. Okay. I have met people who feel remorse for individual things they do, but they do not have remorse for the ideology that they embrace. And I'll give you an example, okay, to try to put a human face on it. Colby introduced me to a guy named Evan Parker, who had was a senior CIA officer, veteran of World War II, who was the first person in charge of the Phoenix program in 1967 in Saigon. And I went and I interviewed Parker, and we became friendly. And because Colby had sent me, he told me everything about Phoenix that he could. And I went and I saw him a second time. And in the second occasion, it was like February, and it was very cold, and we were going to meet another individual at the Fort Myer Officers Club. Okay, this is where officers go for lunch around Washington, D.C. And we drove over in my car, and we had to walk down steps from the parking lot to get to the Officers Club. And there was a little landing halfway down, and the steps are icy, and it's a wintry day with a wintry mix in the air, and we're both dressed up with wool overcoats, wearing a suit and a tie. And this guy, Evan Parker, was like 6'2", a kind of a ruddy face. He'd had a stroke, so I had to hold his arm going down the steps, which are a little icy. Okay, so we're very close physically in proximity, plus he likes me. And we get to the landing, and we're standing there, and out of the blue, just out of the blue, I don't know what we were talking about, but out of the blue, he just says, in the OSS, they told me one day, you're going to be in France. You're going to be dealing with the resistance, the underground resistance. You're going to be in a farmhouse with guys from the resistance, okay? And you're going to be planning to sabotage a German train, a Nazi train. And you're making plans with these partisans, And all of a sudden you notice that in the barn or the farmhouse where you were, an 8-year-old kid is listening to what you're talking about. And he looked at me, and he looks up into the sky, and there's tears coming out of his eyes. And he goes, well, you know what you got to do.
Yeah.
So for him, he felt remorse because, and I got the feeling he really had done this. He's not just making it up. He's putting it as a hypothetical, but he would not be weeping if it was not actually what had happened, something similar to that in his life. Okay. So he felt remorse at that moment. And like all these guys, like my father, who I hadn't spoken to in 10 years before, he confessed to me. These guys carry this stuff around inside them, and they internalize this stuff, and they don't tell their own families. And the only way you can deal with that is to reassert the goodness of what you're doing. not to question the goodness of what the CIA is doing. And so, again, it becomes a self-perpetuating delusion. But periodically, all these guys feel little pangs of remorse for individual things they do. But they do not feel remorse for being part of the system that creates all these things. So they're complex people. And I was, winding my way through that. And, once I had figured that out, all I had to do was just be the son that they wanted to tell their secrets to, and to unburden themselves, these little pieces of themselves. And they thought that by unburdening themselves in these little minor ways, that somehow they would be redeemed. This guy Parker, for example, was a deacon in his church. He was going to church every day. He considered himself a good Christian. All right. So how do people reconcile these things? Well, they don't think about it too hard. They don't think about it at all.
Right. After writing your books on the Phoenix program and the CIA's in relation to organized crime, how did Kobe respond? Was he pissed or?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. This will be the last thing I'll tell you for today, okay? Because I'm getting tired of talking. But when my book, The Phoenix Program, came out in 1990, it got a very bad review in the New York Times, a half a page in the New York Times book review, which is a lot for a book. Most books do not get a half page review in the New York Times Sunday book review. It just, they were letting everybody know that I was a bad person, and it was a terrible book. All right. And the guy who wrote the review was a guy named Morley Safer, who for years was very popular on 60 Minutes, CBS TV show. Okay. He was a big star he had been a correspondent in Vietnam. And I did not know that review came out in 1990. I did not know for 25 years until around 4 or 5 years ago why they chose Morley Safer to write this bad review. But about 5 years ago, a friend of mine sent me a link, and the State Department was having a reunion and can't think of the words, excuse me, just a gathering of State Department officers and journalists who had been in Vietnam. And they were all talking about their experiences in Vietnam. They were reliving all these things that had happened, the State Department people and the journalists, all who have been very close. And Morley Safer gave a 15-minute, half an hour speech at this reunion. And during the reunion, he said, when he was in South Vietnam reporting on the war in 1970, one day William Colby called him up. Colby was in Saigon running an organization that ran the Phoenix program. And Colby called up Morley Safer and he said, can you come with me? Can you get away from all your duties for 3 days and just come with me? And Safer said, well, can I bring a camera crew? And Colby said, no. This is just for you to understand what the CIA does in South Vietnam. Okay, Colby was trusting this correspondent, Morley Safer. He wanted a contact inside, his own contact inside the press corps. So he took Morley Safer with him on a 3-day tour of South Vietnam, and he took him to every major CIA base. There were 4 major bases, 5 major bases. He took them to all of them. And Morley Safer got to sit in on all the briefings that all the top CIA guys were giving Colby in South Vietnam. Okay, so he learned all its secrets. And when it was done, he could not report on them. He knew now, as an insider, everything that the CIA was doing. But again, he couldn't report on it. It was just that Colby was doing him a favor to let him know how the CIA worked. And like in that movie, The Godfather, when Marlon Brando says to the Undertaker who patches up Sonny, He says, someday I'm going to call you and I'm going to ask you to do a favor for me, and that's the deal. Okay. So 25 years later, Colby calls up Safer and he says, you owe me a favor. All right. And I want you to destroy Valentine's book in the New York Times. And so that's how that happens. And that's how the CIA has managed to influence information. One example of how the CIA is able to influence dissemination of information in the United States about its organization and its operations through its contacts in the press and in the New York Times and in the Los Angeles Times and every major news agency. It has correspondents, publishers, editors who are basically owe its favors for getting inside information. And they can call them up and say, destroy this person's reputation, prevent this person from getting a job. And it's all economic. They don't have to do, they don't have to put you in a gulag. They can just deny you, prevent you from making a living as a writer. And nobody will ever publish your book. And they have this old boy network. And this old boy network is vast. It's when you consider that the CIA has been in business for 70 years and has been forming connections in the press and in industry and in every business and in government for 70 years. And all these relationships are private and they're personal and they're maintained. And all the people that they have these relationships with are as ideologically indoctrinated as they are. And it forms this whole parallel society that, again, reinforces all the psychological prohibitions on Americans and the information they get and the way they behave. And it's so pervasive that by the year 2020, nobody can break through it. I become the oddball for being able to have some insight into how it works, rather than everybody being taught how this works in school from the time you're a little kid. This is the country you live in. This is how it works. This is what goes on. Instead, power is maintained through the secret operations and the coercion of people and the co-option of people into maintaining this self-perpetuating ideology that denies anybody the freedom to self-examination, to honest self-examination. Okay? And that's why the whole concept of Hegelian dialectics or Marxist dialectic is verboten. It's forbidden. The whole idea of questioning. It just is not allowed. I have a website, douglasvalentine.com. So you just Google my name and I come up. It takes you right to my website and all my books. And I've done a lot of interviews, so, a bunch of podcasts. So, most of them I'm pretty accessible. But the website's a good place to start. So go to my website, and then it tells you how to buy most of my books, including TDY.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. I really appreciate this, and hopefully we can hear from you again at some point. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.